Diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you say DEI, it causes a lot of people to get pretty upset, especially certain people. Mostly because there's a lot of people that think that DEI implies that you have to sacrifice some form of merit to get that diversity. On paper, what DEI is supposed to be is an opportunity to everyone, regardless of your race or your gender, and it's to make everyone feel comfortable in any work or education environment that they find themselves in. An example of this could be having a dress code that allows for religious attire or creating ramps for people in a wheelchair. Even though all of that might sound pretty good, DEI doesn't always work the way that it should. If you do a little bit of research, you can actually see that there's plenty of cases where companies had to pay large damages because it was found that their DEI practices were actually unconstitutional. In these cases, you can see that DEI actually caused something called reverse racism. Basically, what reverse racism is just when white people don't get what they want.
It's enough to get me to the boiling point!
Okay, I'm joking. Relax. Reverse racism is actually when the majority racial group gets discriminated against instead of the minority racial group. And in America, our racial group just so happens to be white people. Reverse racism can happen when you use extreme business practices to promote diversity. Things like firing someone because they're white so you can hire other people to check off certain diversity boxes. You can actually use Wont Health for an example. They had to pay David Duval, a white man, $10 million because he claimed that they fired him because he didn't check off certain diversity boxes. And they hired 2 women to check off those diversity boxes instead. I don't think that in the end they actually paid him $10 million, but I still think that there was millions of dollars of damages that they ended up paying to him in the end. It's kind of confusing though, because in American history, DEI has actually been a good thing. There are a lot of barriers in the past that there are not now because of things like DEI. It gives a lot of opportunities to minorities, and it stops a lot of that blatant racism that we had to deal with in the past. I feel like in today's world though, DEI is almost doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. Even if it's only in some cases, the case with Wont Health and David Duval, it's never acceptable to fire someone in a workplace to make it more diverse. I don't think that the goal of DEI should be to force diversity. And this kind of leads me into my first question. Is DEI worth advocating for today? Honestly, I don't think that the world that we live in today needs to focus on DEI and extreme practices to make everything diverse. I really don't think that there are extreme barriers anymore that deny minorities access to certain opportunities. Like during the peak of the civil rights movement, for example, where discrimination was a lot more tangible. If you were a black person in America at the time, it wasn't really a deniable thing that there was racism. There was racism everywhere that you went. Most, if not all, black people at the time would have told you that there are plenty of things that they can't do based entirely off their race. And I think that the problem with DEI today is that we're addressing a problem that we don't actually have anymore. I mentioned it very briefly earlier, but racism that we face today just isn't nearly as tangible as it was before. Meaning that when you go outside, you don't see blatant forms of racism, you don't see blatant forms of discrimination, there aren't signs saying no colored people, no black people, you just don't see these things anymore. Of course, there's still going to be a lot of examples of racism and discrimination, but especially in recent years, there aren't many cases of blatant discrimination or explicit bias. Like MLK were able to rise up because they were addressing problems that a lot of people felt. Like I said before, most, if not all, black people in America had to deal with racism. At the time MLK spoke out for all of those people, no one was able to disagree with him. There was a very obvious problem that was going on, and no one really felt very differently about it. It was very obvious that, okay guys, look, there's racism, we need to stand together or the racism is going to keep on happening and all of us are going to suffer. And everyone was able to agree with that. I think that today we don't deal with all of that explicit bias anymore. We're dealing with a completely different issue. The issue that we're dealing with today is implicit bias. To sum it up shortly, implicit bias is just an unconscious belief that we have about a person or a group of people, and it's a bias that you probably won't be able to even recognize in yourself because you don't know that that bias is a bias. You think that feeling is justified, so you don't actually recognize it as a bias. If you want to see examples of implicit bias in our society today, you should read a study called Discrimination Report Card. I'll link it down below. It basically found that people with white sounding names were called back 24% more than people with black sounding names, even when black and white people had the same exact qualifications. Studies like this show that even if everyone has the same access to opportunities, there are still a lot of hidden and invisible barriers that can take away those opportunities to minorities, black people, and whoever else. I really just don't think DEI, as we use it today, is going to remove those barriers. There was another research paper I was reading submitted by Harvard. Actually, a commenter of mine posted it on my last video on DEI. You should also go check that out. Basically, what it said was DEI hiring practices and training courses don't actually fix implicit bias long term. These studies show that it might make people more aware short term, but over a longer period of time, they actually forget these things or they just stop caring about them. With all that being said, no, I don't think DEI is worth advocating for. Mostly because it makes people pretty upset, and I don't think it's worth the effort trying to convince people that DEI is good or DEI can be fixed. But I do still think that we face a lot of issues with discrimination in this country, and while I'm willing to admit that DEI isn't the way that we need to approach these issues, I still think that we need to address these issues directly instead of arguing about what doesn't work. It starts to feel like that both the left and the right are focused on dying on the hill of DEI, whether it's to keep it or to remove it. But I don't see anyone really talking about what we should do instead, or how do we address the real concerns that people have about DEI. It's just a bunch of screaming matches about how DEI is racial quotas and
DEI is racial quotas. End of story.
And not addressing any of the good DEI has done, and not being able to present any alternatives, or crying that anyone who doesn't agree with DEI is racist or a bigot without acknowledging real problems that have actually arisen on the back of DEI. Even though I don't have the answer to fix everything, I think that exposure to other races and cultures can remove a lot of misconceptions and bias. If you have enough conversations with enough people who are different than you realize it's really hard to just generalize someone based on their race or their culture. Really though, unless everyone involved is willing, it's super difficult to cultivate spaces where you can expose people to a large variety of people. And just to wrap this up, the answer isn't DEI or forcing diversity, but you have to advocate for things that reduce implicit bias by exposing people to other cultures and informing people about how the things they do or say can be biased, even though they may not have realized it before. If you want to see me talk more about this, leave a like, subscribe, and if you disagreed with anything I said, be sure to leave it in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.